You're all very welcome to today's training. This is our financial resilience and climate-related financial disclosures workshop, and this is the third workshop in a series that we've done with Climate NI, so Business in the Community and Climate NI collaboration. So with you today is myself. My name is Megan, and I'm an Environment Programme Manager at Business in the Community. And then we have Amy Bell as well from Climate NI. So I'm going to let her introduce herself shortly. I'm going to start with a quick introduction to us at Business in the Community. And to do that, I have one of our relationship managers, Ryan, and I'm just going to give him the floor for a few minutes to give you a brief overview of what Business in the Community is. Obviously, as a membership organisation, there may be some members and some non-members on the call, so I'll let Ryan talk through that for a second.
Thank you, Megan. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to join for what probably will be less than a few minutes this morning, just to talk about business in the community more broadly. So hopefully the fact that you've joined the webinar says you know a little bit about what we do, and Megan has kindly shared a slide which will summarise it very well. People, Planet and Places is how we talk about what we do. It's very easy to remember. You're obviously here today to learn more about how you can improve your environmental performance. But we support organisations in a variety of ways through, for example, the training you have today, but also through various other programmes that fall under those umbrella terms. So I wanted to really talk to the non-members this morning to say that should you or a colleague want to explore further what we actually do and how we might be able to support your organisation, my email address is on the screen, so if you would like to take a photograph or reach out, I'll be happy to have a conversation with you to see what more value we can offer you. I'm sure you will get a lot of value out of today's training, and there's a lot more that we can offer, and I'll leave it at that. The ball's in your court. Happy to have a conversation with you and yeah, explore what priorities we can support. Okay.
Fantastic. Thanks,
Megan.
Ryan. So yeah, just putting a face to the name there. If you have any queries about our membership, Ryan is your guy to talk to. But yeah, like Ryan said, we've got People, Planet, Place are the sort of pillars that we operate under at BITC, and I'm within the environment team. So within the environment team, we've got our three other sort of subheadings that we work under. With business action and climate, which is things like this, training, advisory services, all those sorts of things, sort of fill in areas where people feel like they might not have the knowledge on certain areas, and sort of upskilling in certain areas as well. We also have our NI environmental benchmarking survey. So this is one of our biggest projects, and it's a free sort of self-disclosure exercise where you can sort of answer questions about your environmental performance, and then you get ranked against other organisations in NI. I mentioned that one in particular because I've got some figures, some stats later that relate back to our most recent environmental benchmarking survey, and we kind of can use that to get a feel for what the sort of view is across NI on certain topics. And we've got some ideas on what the consensus is about climate risk and financial risk and so on as well. We also have our nature and biodiversity topic as well, which is relevant in the big picture, but not necessarily so much today with our financial resilience. So that's an overview of what we do at BITC and what I do within the environment team. I'm going to quickly hand over to Amy to give a quick overview of what Climate NI does, and then we will get started properly.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. As Megan said, my name is Amy Bell, and I work at an organisation called Northern Ireland Environment Link, which is really a sector-wide forum body for the environment sector, if you like. But I work specifically on a programme called Climate Northern Ireland, which is funded by the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, and that's the funding pot, if you like, for this work as well with BITC. So what is Climate Northern Ireland? Climate NI is a cross-sectoral partnership devoted to understanding and enabling adaptation and mitigation actions in Northern Ireland that can address the climate emergency. And really we do this through our sort of overall programme aims, and we also have various other projects and programmes that we work across as well. But in the core sort of Climate NI aims and objectives, we aim to support development of policy in Northern Ireland by working with government departments and public bodies, as well as across civil society, including the private sector as well. We engage with the research community to help define and address evidence needs for climate policy and action. We aim to increase coordination and awareness on climate change, and this is what these workshops are part of as well. And then finally, we enable delivery of climate action in Northern Ireland, thinking about the barriers and also thinking about how we build capacity at different scales across Northern Ireland. So yeah, lots of what we're talking about today fit into all those 4 areas of our work. So yeah, really excited to see the outputs from today and get into the detail a little bit more now. Hand back over to you, Megan, to get started, I suppose.
Perfect. That's great. Thanks, Amy. So yeah, just a quick overview here of what we are going to cover today, and then a little bit of housekeeping as well. So as our sort of online webinars, I'm sure you're all very familiar how these work now. Please keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. If you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand, or you can use the chat function. So Amy and I are going to deliver different parts today. So when we're not delivering, the other one of us can keep an eye on the chat. We do have some interactive activities that are going to require a bit more of your attention during this session, so I do appreciate that. If you can limit distractions and try to really engage whenever we put you into breakout rooms, and encourage you guys to discuss with those people in there. So just try and make the most out of that and try and use it as a learning activity. We have that worksheet that was sent out just about half an hour ago, and there's also a link to that in the chat if you weren't able to access that. So it will be useful whenever working through those activities as well. Crucially, everything that you share within your breakout rooms, or if you give some feedback to the main group afterwards, is all completely confidential. So it's going to stay in this room. We are recording today's webinar, and parts of that will be shared potentially in the future. But if there's any discussions that happen, those will be cut out of the recording. So don't let that hold you back from sharing your thoughts. And what is said in the breakout rooms isn't recorded at all. So that's completely confidential as well. So that's our main housekeeping. In terms of what we're going to look at, we're going to start with just a general introduction to climate risk and financial risk. We're going to touch briefly on the difference between public and private reporting, and then we're going to spend the majority of the first part looking at some of these key reporting frameworks. So we've got the IFRS S1, S2, which links back into previous TCFD. We've got the UK SRS, and we've got CSRD for any sort of wider EU financial reporting. In part 2, we're going to look at IFRS S2 in a bit more detail and actually dig into the reporting framework and do an activity based on that. Then we're going to start looking at how we can turn our financial disclosures into action and think about some next steps that you could take after this workshop, and then sort of broadly looking at resilience strategies and what that might look like for you, maybe in some different sectors. Some of you guys can share your thoughts on those as well. So that is an overview of what we're going to look at. Now I'm going to ask you guys to hopefully share some thoughts. This is just a Slido activity. This is going to be anonymous. It's going to form a nice word cloud on the screen here. So when I pop up this next slide, there should be a QR code there. If you're able to scan on your phone, or if you go to slido.com and enter that code, I just want you to share what comes to mind when you think of this word financial resilience. And I think once you guys start sharing some thoughts, that word cloud can form and we can see what the consensus is in the room. So what does financial resilience mean to you or your organisation? And having any joy with that? Perfect. I can see a few people typing now. Right. So thinking about sustainability in a broad sense, sustainable operations. Sustainability is coming up as well. So your long-term operations, so thinking about your business continuity, perhaps, and how things might change. Thinking about your supply chain, yeah, so it's not just you, it's everyone that you work with, your continuity, risk management, we'll definitely talk about that today, how you can adapt to change, how you can future-proof. Yeah, thinking about sustainable growth as well, so the growth opportunities within all of this. Financial stability, ability to withstand financial disruption, absolutely, that will be a big one. So a big part of the disruptions that we could face here could be related to climate and some of our more extreme weather that can cause disruption. And of course, we want to mitigate against that and be able to withstand that. And future-proofing coming up there. Fantastic. I love that. I feel like we're all on the same page here, and we're definitely going to touch on those things as we go through today. On that, I have another question, so this should pop up if you stay on the Slido page. I want to know, how confident do you feel navigating climate-related financial disclosures? So 1, not very confident, and 5, feel like you're very confident. Again, it's all anonymous, just to get a feel for what people are experiencing in the room. So, all right, bit of a mix. Okay, perfect. So not going to dwell on that for too much, not much to say, but hopefully by the end of this session, you'll bump yourself up a little bit in that confidence level and feeling like your understanding is a little bit higher. So that's fantastic. Thank you, guys. So our average there about 2.1. Okay, perfect. Getting into some of the content now. Our general sort of background for why this is all relevant is looking at climate change and business risk. So as we know, climate change is a threat to all of our businesses, and there are a range of climate change impacts being faced across Northern Ireland. These can cause things like disruption, delay, and frustration, and it can come in various different ways. There's various different types of risks. So you can have your physical risk, which is simply storms, floods, how that's going to impact your buildings or your operations. We also have transition risks. These are risks that we face as we transition towards a new sort of green economy. So things like policy changes, new reporting requirements, even changing consumer demands would be within that as well. So that's kind of within the NI context. We know that there's going to be climate change and impacts. What we need to think about as well, though, is that we live and we work in a global market, and this means that global climate change impacts are also going to affect your business. So it's not just the physical risks that are happening here. It's not just maybe our storms and floods. If any of your supply chain is in another part of the world that faces different climate risks or even more extreme climate risks, that's something that you're going to have to think about within your wider supply chain sustainability, and that could have knock-on effects on your finances. So there is this growing expectation around climate disclosure for organisations across the UK and Ireland, and a big part of that is understanding your supply chain and having that accountability as well. So this idea of climate-related financial disclosure is simply about understanding your risks and communicating those risks and opportunities about your organisation, either within your stakeholder network or within maybe just even your staff for now. And things we're going to touch on today are things like maybe the TCFD, the IFRS, some of these frameworks that are going to become clear as I get into them today. But we're not going to have time to go into the extreme detail of every single framework. But what you will see is that a lot of them have the same core principles. And that's what we're going to focus on today, understanding those core principles. And then, you can take those away and apply those when the time is right for you. So we're thinking about the financial disclosures and reporting that might come in the future, even if at the minute it's just something that you're doing voluntarily to get ahead of the curve. So thinking about climate risks, I mentioned a few there, the likes of your physical risks, your transition risks. This is the last slide of question I'm going to ask. So in the past 5 years, have you observed any direct or indirect impacts of extreme weather or climate change on your business? So there's a few pointers there for what direct might include, so your damages, things like that, and indirect could be things related to your supply chain. So for this, I just want to know basically yes or no. I'm not going to ask you to draw them out, but if you feel like you've observed any of those impacts, just go for a yes, no, or unsure. So most people saying yes, there's at least sort of something that's gone within that. And again, it's absolutely fine to be sort of unsure at this point as well. But I can see a big majority of people there are saying yes, which is what we would expect to see. So the reason why I asked that particular question is because this is one of the questions that we ask in the NI Environmental Benchmarking Survey. And I mentioned that in the intro there, just that this is one of our main pieces of work at Business in the Community. In the last year, we had over 150 organisations in NI taking part. So it gives us a good overview of what sort of challenges are being faced by organisations here. And this is the response from last year's 2025 report. So to that question, 57% say yes, they have been impacted. So more people in the room being impacted rather than this sort of average over 150, 160 participants. But the consensus is really strong there. People are seeing these impacts, whether it's direct or indirect, they're seeing the impacts, and it's not something that can really be ignored any longer. Within the survey, our follow-up question was for people, if they answered yes to that question, we wanted them to provide an estimate of the financial cost to their business due to those events. So you can have a think yourself if you have an idea in your head of what the financial cost might have been for you if you said yes to the previous one. But these are the kind of things that we've seen coming up. So people saying they've had to close their offices and stop work due to storm alerts. So around 190 staff still had to be paid, even though the office was closed. Extreme weather and red weather warning, again, leading to closure of construction projects, about £170,000 in employee wages. Direct damage causing about 40,000, closure of business for a full day, about 160,000 maybe in wages, and then having taken out an environmental insurance policy, about £36,000 a year. So huge financial impacts there, and this organisation acknowledging that weather plays a critical role in many parts of their business. Another one here just saying thousands of pounds from climate-related supply chain issues, and that's because of fluctuations in raw materials, crop failure, things like that. And then another person just acknowledging the impact on their insurance excess and premiums and how that has gone up significantly in the last couple of years. So very real and very tangible financial risk that's being experienced across NI, and all of this is due to climate risk. So it's very much at the front of any organisation's agenda if they're thinking about how they're going to future-proof their business, and that was something that came up in our word cloud as well, which is fantastic. So why is this important? It's kind of hard not to acknowledge that it is important with those figures just behind us, but even additional things like future regulations. So many environmental regulations in the UK currently are not mandatory, especially for SMEs. But in the future, there could be a bit more external pressure on you to be able to understand your climate risks and opportunities and to be able to report on those. It could be that you're part of a supply chain of a larger organisation and they might fall into eligibility criteria for certain mandatory reporting in the future, and they might be coming to you for that information in order to fill their data gaps as well. And then, of course, with all of this, there's always a reputational and leadership benefit as well. So staying ahead of the curve is really good for business. There's new areas of work in this as well. There's lots of opportunities within this new green economy and the potential to be a leader in your field as well. So if you're in a position where you can make changes and then filter them out through your supply chain, that can have huge knock-on effects, and that's a really positive thing to be doing. So the why is very clear at this point. What I'm going to look at now is actually some of the reporting frameworks that are relevant or could become relevant to you in the coming years. So these frameworks we're going to look at are all climate-related financial disclosures in different ways. And these disclosure frameworks bring sort of structure, they bring consistency, they bring credibility to how an organisation might report on sort of climate-related information. It allows for benchmarking, it allows for comparison over time, and it allows for comparison against even other organisations in the same sector or different sectors. But crucially, it's just about getting that consistent data, consistent, accurate data that you can use to review your progress. There is potentially going to be a shift in coming years from voluntary disclosure to an expectation of disclosure. And that is, again, something to be aware of. So some of the things I'm going to talk about today, I'll acknowledge that they are voluntary at the minute, but there are some more that have timelines of when that could become mandatory. So it's even just something to be able to know that you can check in 3 years, we need to be doing this. Let's start now. And again, these frameworks and tools can help you identify these sorts of climate risks and opportunities, and they can help you form strategic responses in a really clear way. So even if it's the case where you're going to be in some sort of voluntary disclosure area for a long time, even performing this exercise voluntarily gives you so many benefits as an organisation. You're going to see what your hotspots are. You're going to see where you can save money, where you can improve efficiency, all these sorts of things. And they're all filtered in with those core pillars of reporting that we're going to touch on today. So our major frameworks are IFRS S2. I'm going to look at that one first. We then have the UK Sustainability Reporting Standards, which are an upcoming standard that is based on the IFRS S2. And then I'm going to touch very briefly on CSRD and what that means for your wider supply chains. So on the right-hand side there, that graphic shows our 4 pillars of climate disclosure. So they are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So quite a lot to take in, especially if it's new to you, but crucially, nobody's expected to be perfect at this point, but it is really crunch time. It is time to get started. So when we look at our public versus private reporting, what I'm mostly going to focus on today is things that fall into this sort of private category. So private companies follow corporate sustainability and financial disclosure networks, and that is the likes of your IFRS S1 and S2 and the UK SRS. And for private companies, the accountability is therefore to their investors. Public bodies is different. They're going to follow sector specific guidance. There's a few examples on the screen there, but depending on what sector you're in, if you're in sort of a public organisation, you're going to sort of know where you go to get that information. And there's going to be some specific guidance in that would relate to you, would relate to your timelines and how you might report on certain things. But what I'm going to talk about today in terms of the sort of core pillars of how this reporting works will still be very much relevant for you, I would say. But the main difference then would be the public bodies have accountability to citizens, and they focus on things like emissions, estates, procurement, public value in their reporting, not so much that sort of investor risk that might link into the financial reporting that we're going to talk about today. This is a quick summary of the guidelines, and this is included in the toolkit worksheet that I've sent to you guys, which will be useful to refer back to after today, but it gives an overview of the ones we're going to look at. So if I start even with the IFRS S1, S2, which is in the middle there, this is a global framework. Its aim is to focus on investor-focused reporting, and it's voluntary unless it's adopted by a jurisdiction. So in the UK, it would be voluntary currently. It focuses on financial materiality only. So we're looking at how climate impacts our finances. And like I say, it's currently voluntary. What comes directly after that to the right is the UK SRS. So this is a UK specific sort of guidance framework that is currently in draft. And it's basically a UK endorsed version of the IFRS reporting. So it takes this global framework and it's just making it UK specific. So whenever that comes into force, that's going to apply to UK listed companies first and then expand off the back of that. It's also financial material only, and it'll be mandatory for in-scope UK entities once it's adopted. So once it's fully adopted across the UK, there'll be likely a phased-in approach, and bigger organisations will have to adopt it first, and then it'll filter down. Back over to the left then at the CSRD, that is our EU guidance framework. It's broader than any of the reporting under IFRS. It takes in broader sustainability and ESG reporting. It applies to large EU companies and non-EU companies with significant EU turnover, so it could be relevant depending on your supply chain. For materiality, it looks at double materiality, so it looks at your financial materiality, so how your finances are going to be impacted by climate, but it also looks at the impact your organisation is going to have, so looking at your emissions and things like that and how that's going to impact climate change in the future, and that is mandatory within the EU. So hopefully everything's making sense so far. I'm going to dive into our first framework, which is the IFRS S2. So I've said IFRS a few times now. That's the International Financial Reporting Standards. And then there's Standard 1, Standard 2, S1 and S2. So these set the global baseline for sustainability and climate-related financial disclosure. They were created by the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standard Boards, back in 2021 to consolidate and streamline global sustainability reporting, and it has sort of had that effect. One of its first moves was to incorporate the previous TCFD the task force for climate-related financial disclosure. So it took those the points in that framework and basically applied them to their own framework, IFRS, S1, S2. Broadly, it's very similar. So S2 would be the same as TCFD in terms of the reporting requirements. So S2 is your climate-related disclosures. S1 is more general sustainability-related financial information. Going to focus mostly on S2 today. And this IFRS S2 uses the same four pillars that were used in the TCFD, your governance, strategy, metrics and targets, and so on. But it expands on them to give industry-specific metrics, and it just gives clearer definitions and a clearer structure under each of those pillars. So that's the first standard, the IFRS S1 and S2. And this is a bit more detail on them. So like I said, the S2 is very similar to the previous TCFD. And you can see, if I get my little pointer, where am I? So you can see that the main points to be looked at are governance first, so processes and procedures for the management and assessment of climate-related risks, opportunities, and resilience. You've got your carbon reduction, so strategies and plans to transition to a lower carbon economy, including your metrics and targets for your monitoring and progress. So a lot of the things that you would do to reduce your carbon footprint and so on are going to come about after you identify your risks and then see how you can mitigate against those. And then, of course, our greenhouse gas emissions. So looking at your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, reporting on those and giving a clear idea of the climate impact of your organisation. So that's our S1. You can see S2, sorry. You can see S1 is this broader sustainability related sort of guidance. It looks here at sort of value chain and sustainability, things like workplace safety, labour rights, value chain, other sorts of things. So we're not going to spend as much time on that today. So that is our S2. And these are our four pillars that I've spoken about. So our governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So structured around the original TCFD, now used in IFRS S2. So going through each of those one at a time. Governance first obviously asks us who is in charge. So how is the organisation's board and management overseen, and how do they look at climate-related risks and opportunities? So asking yourself, do we have a sustainability committee? Is there an environmental leadership team that meets regularly? How do we make sure that there are people from every department working on this so that we can have this sort of universal approach in our organisation towards how we tackle climate change and climate risk? So if you can get that under control, you can demonstrate sort of accountability in the actions that you're trying to take for your climate risk. Then we have strategy. So how does this affect the business in the long term? Thinking about how climate-related risks and opportunities affect the organisation's business model, strategy, and financial planning. So an example for that could be if you conduct any sort of analysis on how maybe your supply chains are going to be impacted by extreme weather, or how your building might be impacted by extreme weather, storms, flooding, and so on. And then as a result of your findings, you have to make changes based on those. So if you find out that your supply chain has huge risk because one of your suppliers is in an area that's extremely prone to flooding and that impacts your product, you then need to think, right, we need to diversify this supply chain. So it's about identifying the problems and then taking action based off of that. So you want to make sure that climate risks are sort of shaping your long-term decisions and not just being reported for the sake of it. Then we have risk management. So how do we identify and manage risks? So thinking about how the organisation might do that. So it could be something like a climate risk assessment, something that is updated regularly and includes adaptation measures and actions that can be taken. Again, not just reporting what's currently happening, but thinking about next steps and how you can improve that. That is our risk assessment or risk management. And then your metrics and targets. So how do we measure progress? So this could be things like you're measuring your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, maybe reporting on those publicly. Maybe you have targets to do with your energy consumption, trying to reduce that, or trying to transition to renewable energy on site, but making sure that you are acknowledging what your target is, what the metrics are at each stage, what your interim targets are, and then how you're going to sort of communicate that progress as well. So is it internal, is it external? All those sorts of things need to be considered in your metrics and targets. So those are the 4 pillars that are going to sort of oversee all climate-related financial disclosures. And if this is just a voluntary exercise you're running internally at the minute, these would be the 4 key questions you'd want to ask yourself and ask the whole organisation, ask different departments what their thoughts would be, and sort of consolidate that into your response. So, like I said, our IFRS S1 and S2 are voluntary in the UK. They look at climate risks and opportunities, and the UK is in the process of consolidating the current IFRS S1 and S2 into UK specific reporting guidelines, and that is what's going to become the UK SRS. So that's the UK Sustainability Reporting Standards. Until this is finalised and written into any regulation, the sort of draft UK SRS or the draft IFRS S1 and S2 can be used voluntarily, but they are not required by law yet. So that brings us nicely on to our UK SRS in a bit more detail. So this is the UK's official sustainability disclosure standards, based on and adapted from IFRS S1 and S2. They're going to be phased in for implementation soon, hopefully. They were supposed to be published already, but there's some delays there. And whenever they are implemented, they're going to be on a voluntary basis first, and then mandatory as time goes on. So looking at UK listed companies, potentially looking at larger companies being phased in over time. It's very similar to the IFRS S1, S2. So if you're familiar with that framework, it should be relatively straightforward to jump over to those UK SRS standards. And none of that is in force yet, like I said, because of the timelines that are in place. So back in June 2025, the Department for Business and Trade published drafts of the UK SRS. They have certain amendments in them that make them UK specific. At the start of this year, Jan-Feb 2026, the UK government is still assessing and endorsing these standards, and therefore no mandatory reporting is essential yet, but they are expected soon to be announced in final form. And how you'll know where they're published, these are some places to maybe think about. So the UK government will announce this when it's final, so that'll come from the Department for Business and Trade. That is the primary source for this information. The DBT is responsible for endorsing IFRS S1 and S2 into law, so the sort of final word on that is going to appear there soon. There's other things like the UK Endorsement Board, UKEB. It provides technical advice that goes with the standards. So once UK SRS is published and live, the UKEB will also have guidance notes to go with that, and that will be made available. The Financial Conduct Authority will publish the results that makes these guidelines mandatory for public listed companies, so they will have this up-to-date information as well. And then things like other professional bodies, so the big 4, your PwC, EY, and so on, they will most likely publish a report on this or a blog post on their LinkedIn sort of the day or days after these things are announced. So keeping in touch with them and following them on LinkedIn and things like that, you're going to get the headline news, and then that's when you can dig into the DBT and so on and get the further detail yourself. So that is our UK SRS. This is a really brief outline of what the amendments would be to make the IFRS UK specific. So there were just a few things that changed. And again, not going to go into a huge amount of detail on this, but this one here is interesting. So they have a 2-year climate first approach was proposed. So as you know, like I said, the IFRS S1 is more broader sustainability, and the IFRS S2 is climate related. So they're proposing that there's 2 years to report on S2 first before you need to focus on S1. So acknowledging the climate first approach. They've got some notes on the timing of reporting. So they want the reporting under UK SRS S2 to be at the same time as financial reporting and have that be consistent throughout. And that works well. It'll be within our financial year, the UK financial year. And then different things down here about the dates when it would need to be effective. So that effective date was originally set there as 2024, but that was obviously pushed back because the UK had to make their own amendments to that. So some links here to some resources on that you can look into in your own time, but just as an overview, those are the kind of amendments that are expected. Our last thing then is looking at the CSRD really briefly. So that is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And this is the European Union's major sustainability reporting law, and it significantly expands on what companies must report in relation to ESG. So it's relevant if you operate or sell within the EU, and it's mandatory for large EU companies and non-EU companies with that significant EU turnover. So this came about because it replaced and strengthened the earlier NFRD, Non-Financial Reporting Directive, and it basically just increased the number of organisations that were in scope and needed to report under this. It does take into account double materiality, like I said. So what that means basically is your financial materiality is how sustainability issues the company's value, so how your finances are going to be affected, looking at sort of your climate risk in a financial sense. The impact materiality is how the company itself impacts people and planet. So that would be your emissions. If your emissions are high, you're going to contribute more to climate change and have knock-on effects. And that's the impact of your organisation that you want to reduce, and you would reduce that by reducing your carbon footprint. Your financial impact would be, for example, if you're in an area that's prone to flooding and so on, and you know that that is going to be a continued financial expense for you, it's on you to realise that that is a financial impact and you need to mitigate against that. So identify the risk and then do what you can to change that. So it goes an extra step, not just financial, but that wider impact of your actions. There is the EU Omnibus Directive that relates to CSRD, and basically what that did was just push back the implementation of the reporting deadlines for this for about 2 years. So it didn't change any of the scope of the reporting, it just changed the timelines. And there's some notes there on what that looked like. So for example, the smallest one at the bottom there, non-EU companies meeting EU turnover thresholds, it was 2028 and now it's pushed to 2029. So it's just giving people more time to get up to speed with what's expected of them and get their sort of admin in place to be able to gather this data and report on it consistently. So that will be relevant for some of you potentially. So recap on those main frameworks and what they mean. You've got the IFRS S1 that sets our global baseline for all sustainability related risks. IFRS 2 provides detail on your climate-related risks, and it's built off the TCFD framework. The UK SRS is the UK's endorsed version of the IFRS S1 and S2, and the CSRD is that EU law that requires companies to report on broader information about wider sustainability impacts, risks, and plans. So those are our 4 key frameworks and definitions. Appreciate that was a lot to go through, a lot of me talking to you and at you, but I hope that's cleared up those initial frameworks and what they are and what they might mean. So moving on to some practical activities and looking at what is actually included in these frameworks that I've been talking about. So understanding reporting requirements first under IFRS S2 looks sort of broadly like this. So this is the framework that was used for TCFD and is broadly the same for IFRS S2, and it asks organisations to look at their risks and their opportunities and how that feeds into their broader risk management and strategic planning. So if we start with start with risks, for example, on the left-hand side, your physical risks could be extreme weather, things like that, things like your storms, flooding, things that are going to impact you in your organisation if it's NI based, but also things that are going to affect the physical risks of your supply chain. So that's what you would consider in there. Your transition risks, these are risks that result from the uncertainty created in shifting towards a more sustainable net zero economy. So things like policy changes, legal changes, things like this that are going to be changing how we have to report as an organisation. Changes in technology and how that's going to impact the organisation, changes in market demand and consumer preferences, and changes in potentially how your reputation might be affected based on whether you do or don't do certain things. And the relevance of that is that how all of these risks are going to have impacts based on climate. They're also going to have impacts on your financials. So impacts on your cash flow, impacts on your insurance, how you budget for certain things, and how you put money aside for risk management related to some of these things as well. We also have our opportunities then, so it's not all negative. Within opportunities, there are opportunities for things like resource efficiency, better energy sourcing, renewable energy, potentially new products and services, new markets you could break into, and things like improving your resilience in organisation. So that will be done as a byproduct of things like reducing your climate-related risk. But as we know, essentially your IFRS S2 covers all essential information about a company's climate-related risks and opportunities. And as you can see in the middle there, it's linked in to the wider risk management and strategic planning. So a really good exercise to do is to basically outline all of the risks and opportunities that relate to your organisation, and then think about your 4 pillars of financial resilience, and think about how what you're already doing in those areas could impact your risks in the future. And this is an example of what that might look like for business in the community, for example, so where I work. So if I start with looking at risks on the right-hand side there, we've got physical risks. So we've got extreme weather, we've got storms, flooding, we've got disruption to work-related travel, we've got office safety. Transition risks could look like the rise of technology and AI, could look like political relationships, it could look like reputation risk. So we are sort of delivering training and information to people. We want to make sure that we're delivering high quality information. So there's a risk in our reputation when we're talking about net zero even. There's also potential change in consumer demand, and that would be a transition risk for us, because a big part of our job is helping companies move towards net zero. And hopefully as more people get on that journey, there's going to be more interest in that as well. For opportunities, we have opportunities to support our members in their responsible business. We have opportunities to contribute to NI's net zero pathway, and closing various information and education gaps, and helping build resilience to climate change across NI. So those would be our risks and opportunities. Across the 4 pillars, these are things that we're either already doing or thinking about what we could be doing. So within governance, things like a climate steering group that help keep us on the right track and in the right direction of what we're working on. Environment leadership team as well. Within our strategy, we have an environmental strategy, we have a carbon reduction plan, and those are all part of our wider strategy as an organisation. So they don't just sit alone, they're integrated. We have risk management, so we have climate risk assessment for all our offices. And then we have various metrics that we use as well. So we have our EMS in our offices, which is audited regularly. We measure our energy use, we measure our emissions of our office, of our travel emissions of employees, and then we have various targets within scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So there's lots of metrics there that we can relate back to. So that's just an overview of us. So we're, office-based organisation. We don't sort of create products or service delivery. That's going to look different for some of you guys depending on your sector. So what this takes us into is our first activity, and I basically want you to do just that. So if you're able to open up the worksheet that I sent earlier, or the one that is linked in the first message in this chat, there is a table that is set out basically just like this. You've got the 4 pillars and a slot for risks and opportunities. And what I want you to do is basically think about the risks and opportunities that you are likely to face as a result of climate change. Consider how you might react to those under the headings of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics. So this could be things you're already doing or things you plan to do. And then I want you to think about what one action you can do to improve sort of the integration of this into your business continuity planning and your financial resilience. So if there's one thing that sticks out as a big risk, right, what's one action I can do today? Hopefully in your groups, you'll have some different ideas and you can sort of egg each other on with a few ideas. So I'm not going to spend too long on this because I appreciate time's ticking on. But I'm going to open up the rooms in a second, let you guys discuss for maybe 10 minutes or so. And then if anyone wants to share their thoughts back into the group, that would be nice to get a feel for what you guys are talking about. But any questions on that before I open the room? Is everyone happy to do that? Appreciate some people might be not at a desktop and not be able to access the worksheet. That's okay as well, but conversation in your group should be interesting nevertheless. So I'm going to open these rooms now. It is 11:54, so I'll bring you guys back at 5 past.
Hi everyone. Thanks very much. It sounds like the conversations were helpful, and I wish we had more time to talk through and hear a bit more from everyone. But as Megan said, we're kind of moving into the third and final section, if you like, of today's session. So far we've heard lots of information on climate change and business risk. We've heard about the main reporting frameworks, and we have a better understanding, I believe, by the end of today around the reporting requirements under each of the frameworks we've discussed. But now we're going to take a bit of a move into thinking about how we turn climate-related financial disclosures into actions that your business can take forward to become that little bit more resilient and hopefully even in the long term, even more resilient. So at times, any kind of reporting can feel like a bit of a task to get out of the way or even seen by some. And this might be the case in your organization. It can be seen by some as just a bit of a tick box exercise. But in reality, the purpose of many of the frameworks that we've discussed today is really to be more ambitious than this, to use some of these roadmaps to really drive action within business and to benefit both yourselves as your own business itself, but also thinking about how we can have a benefit then for the environment and the climate. And as the topic is today is really about how we make that financially viable as a business as well. So trying to move away from just seeing this as a compliance exercise to being more strategic around risk and opportunity within your business. So we focus today really around the TCFD aligned roadmap, which is the 4 areas that we've covered in detail today. But the UK's TCFD aligned roadmap explicitly aims to get the right information on climate related risks and opportunities across the investment chain. So as you can tell, what I mentioned there about being more ambitious and really looking, as that quote sort of says, around the investment chain, rather than just adding additional paperwork, which no one really wants at the end of the day. And by using these roadmaps, businesses can see the results from reduced costs to improved long-term planning and improved cost forecasting under extreme weather scenarios. And those are some of the things that you actually mentioned right at the start of today. So it's great that we're all on the same page on that as well. And as we keep coming back to, it's a core part of lots of business governance. So seeing climate risk as it obviously is a governance issue, rather than just as an ESG side project. And that brings us back to that first core pillar of TCFD being governance as well. So I think it's always important for us to take a step back and think of what some of the wider benefits of completing climate-related financial disclosures can be. And hopefully these aren't just, we might be speaking to the converted today. So hopefully these are useful for you to take away and have a think about in terms of maybe that convincing that sometimes you have to do in business, convincing suppliers and customers and even some people within our own teams. And one way to do that is obviously by having a sort of bank of benefits that are useful for you to convince others, I suppose, but also internally too. So climate-related financial disclosures help businesses improve their decision-making processes, largely because they force organizations to quantify what was previously vague, as we say, using those 4 pillars. They help reveal financial risks that traditional reporting misses, and that might be that the government guidance highlights that climate change is already altering physical and transition risks. They highlight opportunities and not just risks, for example, new products or access to new green finance, which can be beneficial to everyone. So it's thinking about how we make the most of green finance rather than seeing it necessarily as an obstacle or something that's adding cost to business as well. And they embed climate into core governance. So as I mentioned just previously, climate risk is a business governance issue, really. So it should be on the agenda of senior managers and managing director levels within business. It's not just an ESG side project. Additionally, then they improve comparability and credibility, and this comes back to what Megan mentioned earlier. It allows you to benchmark your performance, and it also allows your suppliers and your clients or customers to benchmark your performance. And when it comes to investors, it can really help build investor confidence as well. Yeah, that's sort of some of the wide benefits. I'm not going to go into each of them in great detail, but hopefully that is helpful in terms of thinking about it, not just in terms of climate and finance, but really about the bigger picture here as well. So one thing I think is always helpful to highlight. So Megan was able to take you through sort of how business in the community have looked at it, but we have an example here, which is a case study from Phoenix Energy, which is as you can see on the NI Business Info through the Invest Northern Ireland website. And this is about how they integrated climate-related financial disclosures into their decision-making processes. And you can have a look through this in full on their website. But a few things that I find interesting in particular is that it shows the benefit of considering those 4 pillars. So the case study covers all 4. They look at governance. When they look at governance, they talk about how this enhanced climate-related intelligence across leadership, as well as other teams. In terms of strategy, is that it's helped embed climate considerations into decision making at all levels. So there's a strategic focus on how they want to position themselves as a resilient and responsible business. So it's that really strategic outlook and thinking ahead. And then in terms of risk management, they identified critical climate-related risks to their business and the systems that they operate within. As you can imagine, an energy company can have really critical infrastructure risks, for example. And they've also then been able to support this with the metrics, which is the final pillar, around costs and possible impacts of network disruptions. And of course, then the bigger impact that could potentially have on their customers. So although we've we're stuck a bit for time, so we're going to move now into the next activity. So we've covered a bit around the benefits of business resilience strategies, and now we're going to look at resilience strategies in a little bit more detail. So we're thinking about some of the challenges that you just thought about in the first activity there, but really what we'd like you to think about here is some of those wider benefits and some of the resilience strategies that you would maybe put in place, some of the solutions, I suppose, if you look at it that way. So in your groups this time, pick out one of the climate-related risks identified in the first activity. The second point then is to state its potential financial implications to your business. And in your group then, the key thing that we'd like you to think about is what actions could you take to mitigate against the financial impact of this risk. So think about how this will improve your overall financial resilience. So we're finishing up good and on time. I don't think I have to go into great detail on this. I'm sure these are part of some of the discussions that you just had. But of course, building financial resilience has all sorts of benefits in terms of diversifying supply chains, and that's what it can look like. These are some of the practical opportunities that you might have already been discussed. But it could be things like stress testing financial decisions against climate risks, thinking about cash flow against potential energy price increases, factoring in insurance premium changes is also really important. So because of the increased risk from flooding and extreme weather events, etc., we are seeing changes to insurance premiums going up. And the earlier you can factor that in, and the earlier you can take action to adapt to those potential risks, and show that to your insurers, then the earlier you can do that, then the more resilient you are to those risks, and you can reduce the potential increases in insurance costs. And then as well, thinking about the procurement and investment side of things, and embedding climate considerations into both those areas, whether that's a sort of climate change risk assessment sort of tick box thing that happens at the procurement side of things, or whenever it's looking to investors and thinking about how they want to see you as a climate resilient business as well. Okay, so we have some examples here then. We can share these, by the way, so don't worry, they're all linked. We can share them in the slides following this, and when we're sharing the recording. So these are some additional resources that we found along the way, as well as obviously the ones that Megan alluded to earlier. But yeah, keep an eye out for things. There's the NI Business Info TCFD sort of introduction and step-by-step guidance. Within that, then there's also a climate risk register tool. If you would like to have a look at that, it's quite a simple climate risk register, but it would get you some of the way in terms of the TCFD reporting. Megan mentioned earlier thinking about and looking for advice from the Big Four. So lots of reports come out, and it's great, of course, that they're accessible for people to look into and understand better the real ins and outs of the policy that maybe you haven't been able to go into great detail today. And there's also guidance that is slightly more expansive, I suppose, on some of the financial planning and budgeting as well. So we're almost right on time in terms of finishing up for 12:30. A couple of key takeaways to finish up the session. And while I'm talking through the key takeaways, you might want to do that QR code and give us some feedback on today's session. It's really helpful for us. So while I'm talking through these, you can go through the link, and it's a very short feedback questionnaire. But key takeaways that we'd love for you to think about going away from today is that climate risk from extreme weather events, flooding, storms, and droughts create significant financial risks for businesses. So when you're thinking about your risk register, it's really important to add climate-related considerations, and especially climate-related financial risks in there. So really try and make it part of your business as usual. The frameworks are there to provide structure and guide you through the steps, but at the end of the day, this makes your business more resilient, so try not to look at it just as a sort of additional admin or red tape. And following today, we encourage you to take one small practical step in your journey. But there's lots of resources available, and doing a first run through the 4 pillars and the climate risk assessment would get you a lot of the way there. So think about what you wanted to do, take those small steps. It doesn't have to be perfect first time. If you do a quick run through the 4 pillars and use some of the guidance that's there to guide you on that, it would get you a lot of the way there, and then you can always go back and perfect it over time. And it also helps you think about and have the sort of information ready whenever someone comes and asks for it. And as I mentioned there, in terms of both the feedback, we'd really appreciate your input on what other topics that you would like us to cover as well. So we're open to suggestions, and that's part of the questions as well. So we really hope this has been helpful for you today. It's been lovely for us all to meet you guys. We appreciate all your input in the activities and the Slidos, etc. And hopefully we'll be in touch with you all shortly. On behalf of Megan and myself, I'd like to thank you very much. If anyone has any questions at all, please do get in touch. You can reach out to myself or Megan at the information that's now on the screen, and we'll share the information on the recordings and slides, etc. following this as well. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, guys.